So today, the topic that I was given to talk to you about is Palestinian resistance, which is the topic that I'm going to kind of glance on, but I really wanted to talk about what that means more than the concept of resistance. I want to talk about violence, which is kind of the implied meaning of that, because Palestinian resistance can take many, many forms. It can take the form of, work stoppages. It can take the Great March of Return. There are many different forms of resistance. But what we were reading about this last week, and what this is kind of all circling around, is the reality of violence and its meaning politically and its meanings philosophically, and to some extent its moral valences, but I don't really want to get too much into that because that's a much larger conversation, and I think more one that you should have with yourself than with me. So first, I kind of want a show of hands about who's done the reading for this week. No judgment. Okay, that's great. So I don't expect you to have read the whole 200-page thing, or really we'll go a little bit into the history of Palestinian resistance movements if you're interested, but the details of that I don't think are that meaningful for a discussion like this. Beyond, it's worthwhile to know them, and it's worthwhile to know the different groups and what they believe, because I think there are core issues to talk about in the other two papers. So first, I kind of want to get this out of the way, which is a really messy, quick look at kind of the core of the Newton piece, which I would guess is the one most people read, right? You can speak out loud. Did you read the Huey Newton piece? Yes. Okay. And it's kind of a classic politics by any other means is war. But in the way that we want to look at it as it pertains to Palestinian resistance, it's important to understand how historically we get to responsive violence. So how October 7th happens, how all Palestinian resistance, specifically violent resistance, has kind of been created, because resistance and violence in this way, like anti-colonial violence or decolonial violence, isn't an independent thing that pops out of the ground. It's not, just a mushroom that randomly appears. There has to be water that has to be rained on, and that rain is inevitably blood. So how does resistance, how does this start? I'm gonna kind of abstract away and talk first about Hegel. Yay! Everybody loves talking about Hegel. Who here has read Hegel? Congratulations. There's no such thing as this. You've read Hegel. If you've opened Hegel, you've read Hegel. Congratulations. And specifically, Hegel is, he has a huge corpus that's all super fun and everybody should read forever. But he has a more important single little chapter from the book that's right there, which is Phenomenology of Spirit, that is about the Er-Necht dialectic, also known as the Lord Bondsman dialectic, and also crucially known as the master-slave dialectic, which is a mistranslation, but is important nonetheless. And this is an important concept to understand going forward through what we're going to be talking about, getting us all the way to violence. Because in the most abstract sense, in the most, I'm not going to spend an entire 30 minutes talking about Hegel, even though I desperately want to. What it's about is the only way for us to become self-conscious human beings is for someone else to recognize us. Self-consciousness is not an independent action that happens inside you. It happens dialectically outside of you. But while that is kind of a floofy, nice version of it, Hegel's is a lot more brutal. And Hegel sees this kind of recognition as being a violent action where two people put their lives on the line to be recognized by the other. And in the way that the air-necked dialectic happens, one becomes master, one becomes slave, one becomes lord, one becomes bondsman. And that has consequences that go down, and if we want to talk about that a little bit later, we can. But essentially, what that means, past Koyev, who is the person who brought Hegel to France, the person who all of your favorite philosophers either took classes with or took classes with people who took classes with him, how that gets to Lacan and Sartre, and eventually to all the people that we've read and all the people that matter, is Palestine and Palestinians are created by Zionists. The way that Sartre put this is that the Jew is created by the anti-Semite. And when we're talking about Palestinian resistance, and we're talking about violence particularly, it's crucial to understand that there is no resistance, there is no Palestine without the colonizer to create them. And what this means, what Sartre is talking about in The Jew is created by the anti-Semite, is that Jews are people. I'm Jewish, I am a person, I am not a Jew, I am Jewish. Being a Jew, being a set, stable identity that is inevitably deterministic, happens outside of me. Other people see me and create a me that is outside of myself that I have no control over. And they don't just create it for me, they create it for everybody who is termed a Jew. This is the same thing that happened to Palestine in the 20th century. First in British Mandate Palestine, and then really codified and fully formed in its kind of adult form under the Zionist entity, which is, prior to the 20th century, Palestine didn't exist in a real sense, in that there was a place that was Palestine, there were people who lived there who would likely call themselves Palestinian or Ottomans or any number of things. But what that meant as a set identity didn't exist. It was fluid because it didn't really have meaningful referent outside of itself. But the second you become colonized, just like indigenous people in America, the creation of an identity from the outside creates a new identity inside. And when I said I'm not a Jew, that's wrong. I am a Jew. I don't have a choice about that. I was told my whole life that I'm a Jew. I was, called a plethora of fun and totally appropriate names by people. People used to throw pennies at me when I was a kid, which was a great time. I got into fights, and it created a sense of myself that I had no control over. And anybody who is in any identity that exists outside of yourself will have the exact same experience. Many of them much more intense than mine was in my bourgeois public school in the outskirts of Los Angeles. But what this gets us towards is an idea that resistance, in scare quotes, but more importantly, violent resistance to colonialism, is an inevitable creation of colonialism. Colonialism requires violence because colonialism is a violent system that creates identities violently. So if we look at this genealogy here, we get Lord Bondsman, anti-Semite and the Jew, and then we get Glenn Coulthard, who is a Yellowknives Dene philosopher who teaches, I think, in Canada or the Midwest. I don't remember where he's currently at. And Akil Mbembe, who's a Cameroonian philosopher we're gonna get to in a minute. But the other genealogy coming out of Hegel goes through Marx, which uses the same kind of dialectical motion. And it's important to think about this as motion, not as a couple of static identities, because it's always in flux and always in relation to the other identity. It's not as simple It's not as simple as synthesis, antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's not quite that simple because it's constantly going backwards, and there's no real attainment of synthesis in a kind of final form in the way that we're taught in Philosophy 101. It's a motion that's permanent. The way that I like to think about it is how my professor in college described it, is that it's more like a hurricane than it is like a line. And if you think about it as constantly swirling in on itself while still moving, that I think is probably a better image, if we're gonna do an image for Hegel's dialectic, than this kind of perfect little line that goes boop, 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 onto some teleology at the end where everything is perfect and lovely. So Marx used this material, this concept, to analyze capitalism and to analyze the economic system and world that we lived in. He had some really important blind spots where it came to colonialism, which are somewhat fixed in Lenin and certainly fixed in certain ways in Mao. But what I'm kind of trying to show here is that this is the French world. This is the world of pure philosophy, and this is the world of immediate action here. That's not 100% true, and I'm not claiming anything about any of these people. Please don't be mad at me. You can, but don't. But these are the people, and getting down here to where we are, to America, Du Bois, and then C.L.R. James, who's not American, but taught in America, and in fact was a very close friend to the founder of the Afro-Am department at UMass. And we have his papers at UMass, which is cool. And the Black Panther Party. It all comes from this node of an idea of what creates identity, of how we become self-conscious as people. And when we're talking about resistance and revolution, which is really what we're talking about when we say resistance, the theory of violence that I'm about to turn this thing around very dramatically, if somebody will come up and help me, and discuss, anybody can do it, I mean now, all comes from this lineage. So oh no, we're not gonna flip it because I wrote it the wrong way. We're gonna flip this around. Thank you very much. Bam! In red. Whew. I'm all for high drama here. So these are the species of colonial violence, which I'm taking from Akil Mbembe's Necropolitics and from his other work. And I'm kind of adding in some Derrida for flavor, a little bit of Fanon, even though he's stealing directly from Fanon. But these are historical forms of violence. These are, again, not linear. It doesn't all happen and then it's done or it changes in some way. They repeat themselves over and over and over again. But they do go in a pattern, and in a minute, we're gonna talk about this, and I'm gonna start asking you some questions, and I'm gonna stop talking for a little while because I feel you not wanting me to talk anymore. And I feel that because I'm talking a lot. But the first form of violence is originary violence or founding violence. Originary comes from Derrida. He says founding, but he also says originary, Mbembe, but I like originary better because it's a prettier word. Originary violence is the first, call it opening salvo of violence of colonialism. It's the first death. It is what creates colonialism day one. There's always violence at the beginning of a colonial project, inevitably. There's no way to have colonialism without violence. And so the originary violence is often extremely, unbelievably brutal in ways that can only be described as genocide or ethnic cleansing. If we think about, Columbus, if we think about the Nakba, there's no way to think about the origins of colonialism without thinking about the most intense, momentary, brutal violence. And then the second is called violence of legitimation, which is the violence of really consolidation. It's the creation of the colonial state. This continues often the same forms of violence in originary violence, but now the people live there, and now it's finding a violent system that can be repeated ad absurdum forever. So the violence of legitimation is where the language of violence starts to be taught to the colonized people. Because originary violence often is about mass movement and mass extermination. But the colonizers need a colonized to exist. There will always need to be colonized people in a colony, because colonies require not just their labor, which they do require often, but they also require their existence to keep the subaltern within the colonizers in line. There has to always be a colony within a colony. There has to always be colonized for colonizers to exist. And so this is the violence that creates the language through which the colonizer speaks to the colonized. And that's why I put Lacan on the other side, because Lacan's most famous line, does anybody know it? Can anybody give me Lacan's most famous quote? It's, the unconscious is structured like a language. I'd say it in French, but I don't speak French. And Lacan was Fanon's friend, mentor, teacher, not friend. They hated each other. This was a very small group of people who hung out together in France, and they all slept with each other's partners. That's not 100% true, but it's kind of true. Look it up. And so he had the brilliant, now who's read the violence chapter in Wretched of the Earth? I know that was, yeah, so that was an earlier week. But I recommend everybody read it. It's spectacular. It's the best description of colonial violence that's ever happened. And he doesn't outright state that he's doing a Lacanian thing, which makes sense. They weren't friends at the time he wrote Wretched of the Earth. But he is giving us the formulation to understand how violence in a colony can be a language with which the colonizer speaks to the colonized. In fact, the only way that they speak. And when you kind of imagine colonial life, it's crucial to imagine it in this way. Imagine the colonized as being constantly brutalized and knowing what that means, knowing where they're supposed to go based on the violence that is perpetrated on their bodies, on their homes, on their families, on their world. And so the violence of legitimation eventually degrades into the violence of maintenance, which is the day-to-day violence in a colony, which Fanon beautifully calls miasmic violence. And that's violence that's in the air at any moment. Sometimes it's potential. If you're a Palestinian who's going through a checkpoint, you know that there is a chance that you will be murdered. Regardless of what you do, regardless of who you are, what age you are, what gender, what sexuality, it does not matter. There is a chance, a legitimate chance, that you'll be murdered. Miasmic violence happens in America every day. What is a good example of miasmic violence in America? What? Exactly. Anytime there's a traffic stop, even if you're white, though significantly less likely, there is a chance that you'll be murdered for no reason. But if you are a black person in America, if you are an indigenous person in America, if you are a person of color in America, you are stopped by a cop, you know that there is a chance, and for some people, a large chance, that you will be murdered, brutalized, shot, thrown onto the ground. All of these things exist. Why do they exist? Why do people know that? Why are we able to answer this question? Because of the violence of legitimation that creates the language of violence through which the state speaks to us. This form of colonial violence exists everywhere to differing intensities, but it's, even in America, nothing like the regime of violence in Palestine. So the reason I wanted to talk about this, even though this was supposed to be about Palestinian resistance, is the only way to understand Palestinian resistance is to understand that it is a direct response to all of these things. And it is a response in the language that they have been taught by the colonizer. The only way that the colonizer speaks to the colonized is through violence. The only way they can ever be taught to listen is through the same language of violence. This is not a moral point, and that's where Fanon's genius is. Fanon was a psychoanalyst. He was a doctor, and first he worked in the hospital in Algeria, where he went, I'm not gonna get into that, but first he worked with the French soldiers who were brutalizing the Algerian people. And does anybody have a guess what the psychological damage of brutalizing colonized people does to you? You just yell it out at me. Is it good? Do you feel good when you're brutalizing colonized people? No, of course. But then he started working with the Algerian freedom fighters, members of the FLN. And he noticed something very different. And as a scientist, as a Freudian psychoanalyst, a meaningful difference, which is the response to violence against the colonizers was pretty uniformly joy, freedom, a sense of self, a sense of personhood. So there you get to that Hegelian recognition thing, because when Hegel was saying you have to risk your life to be recognized by another person, you have to be willing to put your life on the line and die for this thing that isn't life or death, but to be human is. When you are in this Ernecht bondage, when you are being constantly pressed down every day, told you're subhuman, told you are nothing, that you're less than an animal, to fight back, to perform these sometimes grotesque acts of violence can be the only way that you could say, I exist, I am here, I am real. And so when we think about something as divisive and scary and horrifying as October 7th, where over 1,000 people died. What I am saying is that the violence that was perpetrated against the settlers existed solely as a response and as a necessary response to the miasmic violence of the Zionist state, of the violence of legitimation that created the language of violence that is spoken to the colonized by the colonizers, and the original moment, the originary violence, the founding violence of the Zionist state. The way that violence exists in a colony is all one-sided. Violence is a day-to-day reality for every Palestinian. The only way to conceptualize any form of Palestinian resistance is as a direct and immediate response to the constant violence and aggression of the Zionist state. So that is the basis of what I wanted to talk about now. Now we're going to go to questions and comments. Okay. So why don't we start in 1936 with the anti-colonial revolution of 1936, or the Thawat Filastin al-Kubra. Now, from the reading, anybody who did the reading, do we remember what started this? Okay, so it started due to the figure of Izz al-Din al-Qassam. Izz al-Din al-Qassam was kind of a classic figure, if we think about the other reading, of a revolutionary outlaw or bandit. The revolutionary outlaw or bandit comes from a book called Bandits by Eric Hobsbawm, who is a Jewish British historian who essentially created this concept based on an immense amount of really interesting historical research that shows that these revolutionary figures are made into revolutionary figures by being expelled from the legal society. Al-Qassam is a great example of that by being a colonized Palestinian person in British Mandate Palestine and essentially being forced out of his home, being forced into hiding and becoming a revolutionary figure, not so much by a series of personal choices, but by being put into a position to need to be. After about, I think it was about 5 to 7 years of fighting and hiding and running, he was finally caught by the British Army with the assistance of the Jewish kind of protection forces that existed in the 30s, and was murdered, which caused a massive anti-colonial revolt in 1936. What is most interesting about this to me for today, has anybody ever heard the name Al-Qassam before other than in the reading? Yeah. Yeah. Do you remember what it was? Do you know?
Yes, if you're trying to get somebody to talk about the Al-Qassam Brigade.
Precisely, exactly.
Hamas, they're the military wing of Hamas.
Exactly. So the Al-Qassam brigades of Hamas are the military wing who were directly involved in October 7th. And what's interesting about thinking about this anti-colonial revolution in 36 in terms of today is it's kind of a classic example of anti-colonial resistance being historical while colonialism exists in a perpetual now. Colonial resistance has to, by necessity, remember what happened before, because it is, to some extent, about reclaiming a world that existed prior to colonialism, where, and it, to some extent, depending on who you're talking to, is also about creating a brand new world out of the ashes of colonialism, depending on what philosopher you want to go to. But what is interesting particularly about this anti-colonial revolution, which did not succeed and caused the death of tens of thousands of Palestinians, is it set the seed of anti-colonial resistance and revolution that has continued to grow and blossom periodically in Palestine since then. So then the next thing that was talked about in the essay briefly was the Nakba. And do we know what Nakba means? Can anybody raise their hand and say it?
Catastrophe.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Nakba happened after the UN partition plan, where the UN, with no input from Palestinians whatsoever, created a plan to partition what was then British Mandate Palestine into 2 states, a Palestinian state that included the West Bank and Gaza and a little bit more, and an Israeli state, a Zionist state, that included kind of what was in between, with Jerusalem being managed internationally and owned by neither of them. This came after decades of Zionist money and Zionist support in Britain and in America, pushing the UN to create Israeli state in Palestine. And after decades of vocal and consistent Palestinian resistance to this idea, after World War II, after the Shoah, they were strong-armed into making a state by a series of moneyed interests, particularly in America. Dwight Eisenhower was the president at the time, and I've read his diary from then, which is a fascinating document. But he talks about how he was not interested whatsoever in pushing this forward, but his chief advisor threatened to not let him get reelected if he didn't do it. So we talked about how angry he was about the creation of the Palestinian state by the UN, when he was much more interested in protecting the refugees who had survived World War II and were trying to get anywhere other than where they were killed. But the Nakba was, in some ways, the moment of foundational or originary violence for the Palestinians. While there was certainly other moments like that within the British Mandate Palestine, this was the moment where a colonial state, a permanent colonial state, was set up in Palestine. British mandate was never supposed to be permanent. It was always supposed to be a transitional stage to something else. Britain couldn't afford another colonial holding, especially not one that wasn't giving them the kind of money that somewhere like India was. So they weren't really interested in keeping it, and from about the moment it existed, they had different plans in place to find a way to give it to Zionists. They didn't really have a legal way to do that until the UN allowed them to do that. And Britain was able to just wash their hands of it and be like, it's not our fault anymore, fuck you guys. So the Nakba is the moment of originary violence that displaced tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, included the deaths of, again, the numbers are really kind of squiffy, and I've read a number of different accounts of it, so I'm not going to give exact numbers, but the deaths of thousands at least, the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages, and the displacement of at least 70,000 people. And so once the Zionist entity was able to kind of reduce the population of Palestinians on their land to a point that it was manageable with a little bit of violence of legitimation and then just kind of a low level of miasmic violence, they started looking outwards to finish the state that they wanted. And there was consistent Palestinian resistance and revolutionary action all throughout the late 40s into the 50s, often coming directly from Lebanon or Egypt, where a lot of Palestinians were living at the time, because Gaza and Sinai were given to Egypt, and the Golan Heights were under the control of Lebanon and then weren't anymore after the 60s. But that's where the ethnic cleansing left Palestinians in diaspora. And Palestinians consistently tried, sometimes in smaller groups, sometimes in larger groups, to come back into the Zionist entity, which then led to, the foundation of the PLO in 1964. Okay. And so after the foundation of the PLO in 1964, which took a lot of these movements that were smaller and less well organized, put them under a single socialist heading with an active military wing called the PLA, Palestinian Liberation Army. And when they came out, there was a general call for Palestinians to start and join labor unions. So this was, at the time, a socialist organization and continued to be socialist more or less until the end of the Oslo Accords. So all through the 60s, up until 1967, does anybody know what happened in 1967? Yes, do you know the...
When the borders had not, the West Bank and Gaza were not included in the then borders of Israel.
Sure.
The 48 borders of Israel. He expanded its occupation east and west.
Yeah, so 1967 is the so-called Six-Day War, where Israel claims that they got rumblings of the Arab states around them wanting to attack, so they had to go first. But there's been no proof of that whatsoever. What really happened is Israel took the enormous budget that they had for the military that was given to them at that point by America to some extent, and Britain and France also at that stage, built up the largest military in the region and invaded the nations around them. They took the Sinai Peninsula, they took Gaza, they took the Golan Heights, they took the West Bank from Jordan. It was an amazingly successful military campaign that created the basic Middle Eastern politics that still exists today. And why it was capable of doing that is, a historical question that is kind of up for debate. America up to the 1960s was not heavily invested in the Israeli colonial project. For the early years of the Israeli colonial project, America was kind of a secondary partner behind Britain, and for a while the Soviet Union, which vocally supported the Zionist project early on. But after 67, when they kind of proved themselves as the muscular capitalist arm of America in the Mideast, America suddenly started flooding money and support, specifically in the UN, to the Zionist state. And the reason why this is kind of the watershed moment in Palestinian resistance is suddenly many of the Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed out of the Palestinian state into other states around them were now suddenly under the direct administration of the colonial power that stole their land. Gaza and the West Bank were suddenly under the direct colonial power of Israel. And you then start to get a mass increase of both violent resistance to the Israeli state and nonviolent resistance to the Israeli state, primarily through the auspices of the PLO. The PLO at that point was massively popular, was very successful, and their political win, Fatah, was beloved. Figures from that era of the PLO are still, to some extent, beloved by the Palestinian people like Yasser Arafat. And you then have the next, from 1967 until the 90s, a consistent but low level of miasmic violence with occasional explosions of these new versions of violence of legitimation in Gaza and the West Bank from the Zionist entity, and consistent resistance from Palestine, including, again, work stoppages, bombings, the throwing rocks at cars, suicide bombings, which were one of the most successful versions of Palestinian resistance, pushing the Israeli state to negotiate, which eventually they did in the Oslo, first the Camp David summit, and then the Oslo Accords, which were supposed to be a roadmap for a Palestinian state, but were really just a recapitulation of the basic Zionist idea that Palestinians had to continue to be subaltern, had to continually be subjugated under Israel as the only way for like Zionist safety. They say Jewish safety, but that's not true. As we know, Jewish safety is not helped by the Zionist state in any way, shape, or form. And Jews lived in Palestine for centuries before Zionism was a glimmer of Herzl's eye. So after the Oslo Accords, the PLO lost almost all of its credibility because they had capitulated to Israel and continue to this day, where they still have power in the West Bank, kind of. If anybody has been paying attention to what's happening in Netanyahu's cabinet, do we know who Smotrich is? Smotrich is he's the Secretary of Finance, and he was put in charge of the settlements, but he's also been put in charge of the taxes that the PLO is supposed to get from the Palestinian people, and he's been rejecting giving them to the PLO. So the workers in the PLO have not been paid since October 7th, which is, again, a war crime, as is everything that the Zionist state does. But after the Oslo Accords, you see the rise of Hamas, specifically in Gaza, as a very clear-eyed response to the capitulation of the PLO and the PLA and Fatah, where Hamas proved itself to be a consistent moral voice, comparatively, stating unequivocally that there can be no negotiating with the Zionist entity because the Zionist entity is a colonial force, and you cannot have decolonization without decolonizing, to be frank. So under the auspices of Hamas in Gaza and in the West Bank to a less codified extent, you had there was the Second Intifada, which I think the Second Intifada was directly after the Oslo Accords, or like a couple years after the Oslo Accords. Then you have the Great March of Return, which was a nonviolent protest going to the, border walls, the border fences, where over 200 Palestinians were sniped by Israeli snipers while they were, peacefully standing and singing and protesting, including children, press, and medics. And then the kind of apotheosis up to this point of Palestinian resistance happened on October 7th, where years and years and years of planning created the most successful moment of resistance in the history of Palestine, where in what is unquestionably a beautiful image, you saw the machines of industry, like bulldozers, destroying the machines of war and the machines of ghettoization and the machines of genocide. You saw bulldozers crashing through the fences. You saw dozens of hang gliders, which brings to mind kites, which are a symbol of freedom all throughout the Arab world. And as you perspicaciously pointed out, the number of people who were actually killed by Hamas and the PFLP and other Palestinian resistance groups on October 7th is highly in question. We have an enormous amount of data that says that the IOF shot down civilian Israelis who were fleeing from the scene and were mass murdering Palestinians who were often had already put down their weapons and put up their hands. This is what Israeli survivors have said of their own military. And even with all of that, the number, which is over 1,000, we don't actually know how many of them are Palestinian and how many of them are Israeli. Again, they've obfuscated that and consistently. So, this moment of resistance is to this point the apotheosis of Palestinian resistance, bringing back all the way to the anti-colonial revolution of 1936 with the Al-Qassam brigades, and even calling it Al-Aqsa Flood is a direct reference to the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So I hope this was a useful, if somewhat brief and cursory description of the history of Palestinian resistance. Now let's break up into our three-person groups. I can respond to you then. I'd like to. Sure. Yeah, so the current state of the Palestinian resistance is significantly in question, not whether or not the Palestinian resistance still exists, but the number of fighters PFLP, Hamas, and the other active groups in Gaza and the West Bank still have. The IDF keeps claiming that they've almost eradicated Hamas, which seems absolutely untrue. And, what I know from what I've followed in Gaza, on a daily basis, is that the Al-Qassam brigades have been inordinately successful at halting and stopping the Zionist encroachment into Gaza and have continued to resist the mass destruction and genocide in pretty spectacular ways that even the most, optimistic war reporters did not expect. Nonetheless, again, as is always the case with colonizer and colonized, the colonizer has infinite money, infinite resources, infinite weapons, and the support of the entire capitalist system funneled all into the point of their sword. And the Palestinians are fighting with the things that they can create and their ingenuity and their grit and their love of them, their family and their land and their homes, So while it is a, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't think anybody could possibly guess what's going to happen in the end. What I do absolutely know, no matter what happens, Palestinian resistance will never be over until the Zionist entity is over. There will always be violent resistance to the Zionist entity as long as it exists, because it will always be a colony. There will always be colonized within the colony. And in a very, basic way, there's no possibility of an IOF Zionist victory in Gaza, in West Bank, in all the parts of occupied Palestine, because the only victory that they could have is mass extermination, and that can never happen. There will always be Palestinians, there will always be people to fight, and as long as there's one person, people will continue to fight. And if there's no people, people will fight in their memory, and people will fight forever, and Palestine will be free. That's the answer. So, there you go.